They fired him on a Tuesday, handed him a cardboard box, watched him walk out in the rain, and laughed. By Wednesday morning, military helicopters were landing on the roof, and the woman who signed his termination papers was standing in his kitchen watching him make spaghetti for his 8-year-old daughter, realizing she had just made the most catastrophic mistake of her career. This is the story of Ethan Walker, the man nobody saw coming, and the night that changed everything. If this story hits different, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The elevator doors opened at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening, and Ethan Walker stepped out into the lobby carrying everything he owned at Meridian Defense Technologies in a single cardboard box. It wasn't a big box. That was the part that got him later when he thought about it. 11 years of showing up on time, never calling in sick, never once leaving a job unfinished, and everything he had accumulated fit inside a medium-sized container that had previously held copy paper. A Navy coffee mug with a chip on the rim, a box of protein bars he kept in the bottom drawer, a small electric fan he'd bought after facilities refused to fix the air conditioning in the maintenance corridor, a framed photograph of his daughter, Lily, sitting on the back steps of their house with paint on both her elbows and a gap-toothed smile wide enough to stop traffic. He tucked the photograph carefully against his chest so the glass wouldn't crack. Outside, rain was coming down hard against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian lobby. The kind of cold, steady Chicago rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder, just arrives and settles in like it plans to stay a while. The automatic doors slid open, and the wet air hit him immediately, smelling like bus exhaust and wet concrete and the particular misery of October in the Midwest. Ethan Walker stepped outside. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He walked to the edge of the covered entrance, shifted the box to one arm, and pulled his phone out to check the time. 6:49. If he caught the 7:02 bus at the corner of Michigan and Wacker, he'd be home by 7:34. Lily's school night bedtime was 8 o'clock. He could still make dinner. He stood there doing that math, just the bus schedule and the pasta he had in the cabinet, and whether he had enough milk for Lily's cereal in the morning. And he didn't let himself think about anything else until he was already moving down the sidewalk through the rain, box balanced against his hip, photograph pressed against his ribs. 3 floors up, behind floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the city like a fishbowl built for winners, Victoria Bennett was still at her desk. She had the termination report spread across her screen. 17 names in total, color-coded by department, organized by salary tier and redundancy index. Her HR director, Marcus Chen, had spent 2 weeks building the analysis. It was clean work, tidy, the kind of spreadsheet that made hard decisions look almost elegant if you didn't think too hard about what the rows represented. She'd signed off on all 17 at 4 p.m. By 6:30, her assistant had confirmed that each of the affected employees had been notified and processed. 17 people, gone in an afternoon. Victoria reached for her coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. She was 30 years old, and she'd been CEO of Meridian Defense Technologies for 14 months. The board had handed her the company during a period of significant financial restructuring, which was their polished way of saying the previous leadership had spent 3 years making expensive decisions that looked bold in press releases and turned out to be disasters in practice. Victoria had spent the first 8 months of her tenure putting out fires, rebuilding investor confidence, and learning which of her senior executives were genuinely useful and which ones were very expensive liabilities, who gave excellent PowerPoint presentations. The budget cuts were real. The math was real. She stood behind the decision. She just hadn't expected it to feel this flat. Marcus knocked on her open door. He was a careful man, mid-50s, who wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses he'd probably worn since graduate school. "Final confirmation," he said. "All 17 have exited the building." "Good." He hesitated, which was not like him. "What?" she asked. "Walker," Marcus said. "Ethan Walker. Maintenance. You reviewed his file personally?" "I reviewed all of them." "Right." He adjusted his glasses. He's been here 11 years. The retention notes on his file were strong. 3 separate department heads flagged him as a keep." "And the budget numbers don't care about retention notes," Victoria said. "Maintenance is down 30% in the restructuring. The math isn't personal, Marcus. No, he agreed. It isn't. He left without saying whatever else he'd been considering saying. Victoria turned back to her screen. She pulled up the security footage out of habit. She'd developed that habit, reviewing exit footage, not from distrust, but from a sort of bleak accountability she imposed on herself. She believed if you were going to make a decision that affected people's lives, you should at least have the dignity to watch what it looked like. She found the lobby camera, rewound to 6:47. The elevator doors opened. A man walked out carrying a cardboard box and a framed photograph held against his chest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that didn't read as arrogance, more like someone who'd spent years carrying weight and had organized his body around it. Dark hair, slightly too long, probably because he'd been too busy to get it cut. He moved through the lobby quietly, without looking around, without making eye contact with the security desk guard who glanced up as he passed. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate, just walked straight through the automatic doors and out into the rain. She watched him go. Something about the image, this man, this box, this single-framed photograph, sat in her chest in a way she couldn't quite explain. She closed the footage window and pulled up his file for the second time that evening. Ethan Walker, age 32, maintenance technician 2. Hired 11 years ago, which meant he'd been 21 years old when he walked through those doors the first time. His employment record was clean to the point of being almost suspicious. No disciplinary notes, no attendance issues, consistent performance reviews averaging in the top 15% of his department. The 3 department head flags Marcus had mentioned were all there: physical plant, IT infrastructure, and building security, each noting Walker as a high-value resource in language that felt too formal for what they were actually trying to say. Emergency contact, Lily Walker, age 8. Relationship, daughter. No second contact listed. Victoria closed the file. She went back to work. In the break room on the 3rd floor, 4 members of the maintenance crew were in the middle of what had started as a discussion and evolved into something uglier when word got around about who'd been let go. 11 years, said Danny Reyes, who ran electrical systems for the East Wing and had, on 2 separate occasions, borrowed money from Ethan that he'd never paid back. 11 years and they walk him out like he's nobody. He was nobody, said Gary Hollis, who was not particularly kind and didn't pretend to be. Gary worked the overnight HVAC shifts and had spent most of those 11 years mildly resentful of the fact that Walker was consistently more competent than him without appearing to try. Maintenance tech. You want to make yourself irreplaceable. Maybe don't spend your whole career fixing thermostats and unclogging drains. He didn't just fix thermostats, said a younger woman named Priya, who'd only been at Meridian 8 months and hadn't learned yet when to stop talking. He rebuilt the entire backup power routing system for floors 12 through 20, solo, in 3 days. Ask anyone in IT. Ask IT, Gary repeated, as if this were the funniest thing anyone had said. Right. Next time there's a crisis, I'm sure Walker will roll in and save the day from his next job at whatever other building he ends up mopping floors in. Danny laughed, though it sounded a little uncertain. Priya looked at Gary for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee, got up from the table, and left the room without saying anything else. The bus was 4 minutes late, which put Ethan at his stop 7 minutes behind schedule. He got home at 7:41. The house was small, a narrow 2-story rental on a block of narrow 2-story rentals in Pilsen, the kind of Chicago neighborhood that was perpetually on the edge of becoming something else, caught between the residents who'd been there for generations and the coffee shops that kept appearing on corners. Ethan rented the left half of a converted 2-flat from an older man named Mr. Kowalski, who lived on the ground floor and had opinions about lawn care that he communicated primarily through notes left on the front door. The kitchen light was on. He could see it from halfway down the block, the warm yellow square of it in the dark, and he knew, the way you know things after years of paying attention to a person, that Lily had gone into the kitchen to get a glass of water and left the light on behind her, which she did approximately every other night without fail, and which he'd given up remarking on months ago. He stood on the front steps for a moment with his key in his hand and his cardboard box balanced against his hip. He thought about the conversation he was going to have. Not tonight. Tonight was not the night. She was 8 and she had school in the morning, and he was not going to sit her down and explain job loss and financial uncertainty to a child who had a spelling test on Thursday. But eventually. Soon. The particular grinding practicality of being the only adult in a household was that you didn't get to feel things on your own schedule. Things needed to get handled, and then you could feel them later, in the car or in the shower, wherever you could find 10 minutes to yourself. He put his key in the lock and pushed the door open. Dad. Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, already in her pajamas. The ones with the small foxes on them, which were slightly too short in the legs now, and which she had refused to stop wearing for reasons she'd never fully explained. She was 8 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and a very serious, evaluating look she put on when she was trying to figure something out. She was wearing that look now. "You're late." Bus was late. The bus is always late. That's true. "Did you eat?" He looked up at her. She was standing at the top of the stairs with her arms crossed, in the posture of someone conducting a welfare check. He had no idea when she'd started doing this, monitoring whether he'd eaten, asking if he'd slept, reminding him to take his phone off silent. Somewhere in the past year, she'd developed this quality, this watchfulness, and he didn't know whether to be touched by it or troubled. "Not yet," he said. "I was going to make pasta. I already ate." "I know, I was going to make it for me." She considered this with the gravity of a municipal inspector reviewing permits. "We have the marinara with the green lid," she said. "Not the one with the red lid. The red lid one tastes like the jar." "Got it. Do you want me to come down?" "It's 7:45, he said. "Get in bed. I'll come say goodnight." She turned around and padded back down the hallway. He heard her door close, not all the way, just most of the way, which was how she always closed it. He set the box on the floor by the door, took off his wet jacket, and went to the kitchen to make spaghetti. He thought about calling his sister Dana, who lived in Milwaukee, and called him every Sunday and had an opinion about everything. Dana would have something to say about being laid off. Dana always had something to say. He appreciated it in the way you appreciate someone who will tell you the truth, even when the truth is mildly exhausting. He'd call her tomorrow, or the day after. He boiled water and opened the correct jar of marinara and stood at the stove with the particular patience of someone who had cooked alone in a kitchen many times. The rain was still going outside. He could hear it against the kitchen window, steady and indifferent. His phone was on the counter. He'd turned the volume up on the walk home, some residual instinct toward readiness, though he couldn't have explained what he was expecting. It sat there quietly while he cooked. After dinner, he washed the single bowl and fork, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs to check on Lily. She was in bed with her book open, pretending to read, which meant she'd been waiting. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up. "Are you okay?" He paused. She was 8. She was observant in ways that occasionally startled him, had been since she was about 4, as though she'd been paying close attention to the world from the very beginning and cataloging information for later use. "Had a rough day," he said. She nodded, taking this in seriously. "Did you eat enough?" "Yeah." "Okay." She closed her book. "Tuesday's almost over." "Yeah," he said. "It is." He crossed the room, pulled the blanket up the way she liked it, tucked at the foot, loose at the top, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. She smelled like the lavender shampoo she'd decided she preferred 3 months ago after smelling it at her friend Maya's house and conducting a thorough lobbying campaign that had lasted 11 days. "Sleep," he said. "I know." He turned off the lamp and left the door mostly closed. Downstairs, he sat on the couch without turning on the television, just sat there in the dark with the rain against the windows and the specific quiet of a house with one sleeping child in it. He'd been a maintenance technician for 11 years. Before that, before Lily, before he'd sat in a hospital and held his wife's hand through the night and then held her absence in the morning, he'd been something else. He didn't think about it often, the way you don't think often about a room in a house you've locked and moved away from. The memories were there. They just weren't useful anymore. He'd built a life here. A small, functional, genuinely good life. The bus route he knew by heart. The school on Paulina where Lily's teacher left detailed notes in her folder every week. The grocery store where the produce guy always set aside the good peaches in July because Ethan had once fixed his sister's car battery for free. He'd lost a job. It happened. He'd figure out the next thing. He sat on the couch for another 20 minutes, then brushed his teeth, set his alarm for 6, and went to bed. He was asleep before 9. Chet, at 9:22 p.m., the network monitoring station on the 14th floor of Meridian Defense Technologies began generating alerts. They started small, anomalous traffic patterns on 2 subnet clusters connected to the building's secure data relay infrastructure. The kind of thing that, in a normal environment, might get flagged for review and assigned to a technician for morning diagnostics. But Meridian's infrastructure was not a normal environment. The building housed server nodes connected to 3 separate Department of Defense communication networks, legacy contracts from the company's Defense Electronics division that had been part of Meridian's portfolio for over a decade. These weren't headline systems. They weren't the flashy offense-side technology that got written up in trade publications. They were quiet, load-bearing infrastructure, the kind of systems that made larger, more visible systems function. Priya Mehta was the IT technician on overnight monitoring. She was 26 years old, 8 months out of a cybersecurity master's program, and she had never in her professional career seen a traffic signature that looked quite like what she was looking at right now. She stared at her screen for 45 seconds. Then she picked up her desk phone and called her supervisor. He told her to document it, and he'd look in the morning. She hung up, stared at the screen for another 2 minutes, and called her supervisor's supervisor. By 10:15 p.m., the anomalous traffic had expanded to 11 separate node clusters. By 10:30, the building's primary secure network had gone into automatic containment protocol, a feature most people in the building hadn't known the system possessed because it had been designed to operate without requiring human authorization. The automatic containment protocol isolated 3 floors of servers. It did not stop what was happening. It slowed it. The IT director, a man named Fitzgerald, who'd been dragged out of a dinner party and was still wearing his sport coat over pajama pants, was standing in the monitoring station at 10:41 when the alert came in from the Department of Defense liaison office. It wasn't a message. It was a phone call, which meant it was serious. Federal liaisons did not call at 10:41 p.m. for anything that wasn't serious. Fitzgerald took the call. Afterward, he stood very still for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he called Victoria Bennett.
Cherisons, that.
She picked up on the second ring because she always picked up. "There's a situation," Fitzgerald said. He had a careful technical way of speaking that usually made him easy to listen to. Right now, his voice had a register she hadn't heard before. "I need you in the building." "What kind of situation?" A pause. "The kind that's above my clearance level to describe on an unsecured line." Victoria was already getting up. Check. She arrived at 11:08, still in the trousers and blazer she'd worn to work that morning. The building felt different at night. The lobby was dim, the cleaning crew gone, the security desk occupied by a single guard who buzzed her through without ceremony. The 14th floor was lit up like a surgery, every overhead light on. 7 people clustered around workstations. Fitzgerald met her at the elevator. "Show me," she said. He showed her. She understood about 40% of what she was looking at. She was not an engineer, she had a finance background and an MBA, and she'd spent 14 months learning the technical vocabulary of the industry she was running, but network intrusion topology was not her fluency, and she didn't pretend otherwise. "Tell me the bottom line," she said. "The bottom line," Fitzgerald said carefully, "is that someone is in our systems, not surface systems, the deep relay infrastructure, the DoD connected nodes." "How?" We're working on that." "How bad?" He exhaled. "Potentially very bad. These relay nodes connect to critical defense communication networks. We're not the primary target. We're an access point. If they get through the isolation protocols and reach the secondary relay, can we shut it down? We've been trying. Our countermeasures they're not working the way they should." He rubbed his eyes. "The intrusion method is very specific. It's designed to exploit the exact architecture of these systems, the way they were built." Victoria looked at him. "The way they were built," she repeated slowly. These systems were designed about 7 years ago, Fitzgerald said. The DoD contracts this infrastructure out to specialized firms. The architecture it's proprietary, unusual. It uses a non-standard encryption layering approach that was considered experimental at the time. Who designed them? He looked at her for a long moment. Fitzgerald. We don't have that information on file, he said. It's classified at a clearance level above building administration. But about 40 minutes ago, I got a call from a colonel at Northern Command who told me that there is one person in the continental United States who designed these specific systems and understands them well enough to run an effective counter-operation. He paused, and he gave me a name. Victoria waited. Ethan Walker, Fitzgerald said. The floor seemed to move slightly under her feet. She heard her own voice, very calm. Our Ethan Walker. Your former Ethan Walker, Fitzgerald said, as of approximately 6:47 p.m. this evening. The next 40 minutes were the most disorienting of Victoria Bennett's professional life, and she had once had a disorienting professional life. The DoD liaison, a woman named Colonel Patricia Summers, who spoke in the compressed, efficient sentences of someone accustomed to emergencies, walked Victoria through it in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes. Ethan Walker had not always been a maintenance technician. Before Meridian, before, apparently, everything, he had been a U.S. military cyber defense commander with a clearance level several tiers above anything Victoria had ever been in proximity to. He had run cyber defense operations for a joint task force she'd never heard of, handling the defense side response to some of the most significant infrastructure attacks of the previous decade. He had been, by multiple accounts, exceptional at this. Not in the way that produced medals and press releases, but in the way that produced results when results were the only thing that mattered. He had also, 7 years ago, designed and built the emergency security architecture for a classified national defense relay network. The architecture that was, at this moment, under coordinated attack. When his wife died, her name was Sarah. Colonel Summers said this the way you say a name when it means something, not just a fact. He had resigned his commission, without ceremony, had taken his daughter, who had been 2 years old, and simply left. We tried to retain him, Colonel Summers said, multiple times. He was politely unmovable. He said he was done. And he ended up here, Victoria said, as a maintenance technician. Apparently, a pause. We're mobilizing a response team, but I want to be direct with you. This attack was designed by people who know exactly what they're doing. Our best analysts have been on this for 90 minutes, and they can't locate the breach point. Walker knows this architecture better than anyone alive. If we're going to stop this before it escalates to primary relay systems, we need him. Victoria was quiet for 3 seconds. I'll get him, she said. Certo. She called Marcus first because she called Marcus when she needed information organized quickly. He answered on the third ring, groggy, and she said simply, Ethan Walker's home address. Now. A pause. Victoria, Marcus. He gave her the address. She went downstairs to where a black government SUV was already waiting. Colonel Summers had arranged that before the call ended, and got in next to a uniformed military attaché who did not introduce himself and did not make conversation. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched the city go by. The lights on the expressway. The neighborhood she usually only saw from the air when she was landing at O'Hare. She thought about the security footage, the man with the cardboard box, the photograph held against his chest. She thought about what Marcus had said. 3 department heads flagged him. She'd looked at those flags and seen redundancy calculations instead of whatever it was they had actually been trying to tell her. The SUV moved through Pilsen. Narrow streets, 2 flats, the particular geographic texture of a Chicago neighborhood that had not been designed for luxury. It stopped in front of a lit kitchen window. Victoria got out of the SUV and stood on the sidewalk in the rain for a moment, looking at the house. It was modest. That was the word she kept arriving at, though it felt insufficient. There was a bike on the front porch with a basket attached to the handlebars and a plastic daisy tucked into the basket. A pot of something, herbs, maybe dead herbs now in October, sat by the door. A small wooden sign that said, in painted letters 16, the address, painted in what looked like a child's handwriting. The military attaché was already at the door. She caught up to him before he knocked. "Let me," she said. He looked at her, then stepped back. She knocked. There was a long pause, then the sound of movement inside. Why, careful, not startled. The kind of sound someone makes when they heard something and are moving toward it deliberately, rather than out of surprise. The porch light came on. The door opened. Ethan Walker was wearing jeans and a gray thermal shirt, his feet bare, his hair slightly compressed on one side like he'd been asleep. He looked at her with the particular contained expression of someone who had already had a bad day and was watching the next thing arrive. His eyes moved past her to the military attaché, then to the SUV with government plates at the curb, then back to her. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was flat, not rude, just flat. "Mr. Walker." She stopped. This was, she realized, the first time she'd spoken to him directly. They had been in the same building for however long he'd worked here, 11 years, and she had never spoken to him directly. "I need to... How'd you get this address?" "HR records." He looked at her steadily. "Right. Mr. Walker, I'm aware of how this looks. Do you want to come in?" he said. "Or do you want to stand on my porch in the rain?" It wasn't really a question, the way he said it. He turned and walked back inside. She followed. The kitchen was warm and close and smelled like cooked pasta and dish soap. A single bowl sat in the drying rack. There was a child's drawing on the refrigerator. Multiple child's drawings, layered and overlapping, held up with an assortment of magnets that didn't match each other. A school permission slip was tucked under a pizza magnet. A library book was on the counter with a receipt marking the page. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, not leaning on it, just standing. He was looking at her with the specific look of someone who has already done their math. "Tell me what happened," he said. She told him. All of it. The alerts, the breach, Fitzgerald's assessment, Colonel Summers, the relay architecture. She watched his expression as she talked. It didn't change much, but something in his eyes shifted slightly when she got to the technical details. Something that was not quite alarm but was adjacent to recognition. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 9 years, he said. What? These systems have been running for 9 years. He wasn't talking to her exactly. More like he was working something out. Who designed the update cycle? I don't know. Because when I built them, the encryption keys were set for a 7-year rotation cycle, and if no one updated that protocol on schedule, which they didn't, because if they had, this particular attack vector wouldn't exist. He stopped. How many nodes? 11, the last count I got. He exhaled through his nose. What's the current isolation status? Partial. They've contained 3 floors. That's not going to hold. He said it simply, without drama, the way you say a fact. Where's the breach point? We can't find it. No, he said. You wouldn't, from the outside. He looked at her. I need access to the primary relay monitoring interface and a secure terminal. Not the building's public IT infrastructure. The specific diagnostic terminal in the infrastructure control room on floor 16. There should be one. There is, she said. She actually didn't know this, but she was fairly certain if he said there should be one, there was one. I need about 5 minutes to get ready. He unfolded his arms. And I need to call someone for Lily. The way he said it, not asking permission, not explaining himself, just stating a condition of his cooperation, was unlike anything she'd encountered in a professional context. It was the statement of a man who had ordered his priorities a long time ago and was not interested in renegotiating them. Of course, she said. He left the kitchen. She heard him on the phone in the hallway. A brief, low conversation, the kind you have when you're trying not to wake someone upstairs. Then she heard him on the stairs, moving quietly. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the drawings on the refrigerator. There was one that appeared to be a portrait. 2 figures, one tall and one short, rendered in crayon. The tall figure had dark scribbled hair and was holding the hand of the short figure, who had what appeared to be a crown of yellow scribbles and was grinning, the smile drawn as a wide, emphatic curve that took up most of the lower half of the face. Underneath, In the uneven lettering of a child who had recently learned to write, it said, "Me and Dad." Victoria stood looking at it for a long moment. Oh. Upstairs, Ethan sat on the edge of Lily's bed in the dark. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She always was when something was happening. She had that quality, some proximity sensor to the frequencies of things being wrong. "You have to go," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." "At midnight?" "Close to it." He kept his voice steady. "Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs is going to come up and stay. You remember her?" "She smells like cinnamon." "That's her." Lily was quiet for a moment. In the dark, he could see the shape of her, the small, serious face looking up at him. "Is it important?" He thought about what to say. He settled, as he usually did with her, on something close to the truth. "Yeah, Bug. It is." "Okay." She shifted, pulled her blanket tighter. "Don't forget your jacket. It's raining." "I know. And eat something if they have food there." He almost laughed. "I will." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. She smelled like lavender. "I'll be back," he said. She was already most of the way back to sleep by the time he stood up. 8-year-olds had a gift for that, the capacity to trust and let go and fall back into sleep when they felt safe enough. He stood there for another few seconds in the dark. Then he went to get his jacket. In the kitchen, he passed Victoria Bennett without looking at her, opened the refrigerator, and drank directly from a bottle of water, set it back. Picked up his phone off the counter. "There's something I want to say to you," she said. He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who had spent a long time learning to be decisive and was finding, at this moment, that decisiveness was harder than it looked. "Firing you was a mistake. I'm not saying that because I need your help tonight. I'm saying it because it's true and I've been—" She stopped. "I looked at your file twice today and I still signed off on it, and that was wrong." He looked at her for a moment. "Let's go," he said. He walked to the door and opened it. She followed. The government SUV was waiting at the curb, rain coming down around its headlights in bright diagonal lines. Down the block, the neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked once, somewhere distant. Ethan Walker walked down the porch steps, past the bicycle with the plastic daisy, past the pot of dead herbs, and got into the car. Victoria got in after him. The door closed, and they drove back through the rain toward a building full of people waiting for someone who had never asked to be found. The SUV moved fast through wet streets, running yellows where it could. The military attaché up front not speaking. The city sliding past the windows in streaks of orange and white. Victoria had her phone out, fielding messages from Fitzgerald every 4 minutes with the mechanical regularity of someone who had run out of ways to say we're still losing ground. Ethan sat beside her and looked out the window. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't zoned out. She could tell the difference. He was thinking. The kind of thinking that happens without visible movement, where the person goes very still and quiet, while something works itself out behind their eyes. She'd seen that quality in engineers before, in analysts. She'd never seen it in a maintenance technician. She caught herself thinking that and then caught herself catching herself and felt something close to shame. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He didn't turn from the window. "You're going to. Why maintenance? After everything, after what you apparently built, what you did, why end up here? At Meridian? Fixing thermostats and running cable?" He was quiet for a moment. The city lights moved across the side of his face. "The buildings here are old," he said finally. "Lots of problems. Keeps me busy enough to not think too much." He paused. "And Lily's school is 3 blocks from the office. If something happened, if she needed me, I could be there in 8 minutes." Victoria looked at him. "You took that job to be close to her school," she said. "I took that job because it was available and the math worked." He glanced at her briefly. "Don't make it poetic. It was practical." "It's both," she said. He didn't answer that. Turned back to the window. She let it go. The Meridian building at midnight looked like a different structure than the one she'd left 14 hours earlier. Half the floors were dark, the automatic systems having throttled non-essential power as part of containment protocol. But the 14th floor blazed, and she could see it from the street. That one band of harsh white light high up in the dark glass face of the building, like a lit window in an otherwise empty house. There were 2 military vehicles already at the curb, not the low-profile SUV type, actual military transport, the kind with the markings and the uniformed personnel standing at the doors. 3 figures in dark tactical gear were talking to the building's security guard, who looked like he was having the worst night of a career that had probably never prepared him for this. Ethan got out of the SUV without waiting for it to fully stop. Victoria followed, pulling her blazer tighter. The rain had downshifted to a fine mist, the kind that didn't feel like rain until everything was wet. She watched Ethan walk toward the building entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets, unhurried, and saw the moment one of the uniformed figures at the door recognized him. The man straightened. Not to attention, not a formal gesture. More involuntary than that, the way a body responds to something before the mind gives the instruction. "Walker," the man said. Ethan stopped, looked at him. Something passed across his face, not recognition exactly, more like the complicated feeling of recognizing something you'd worked hard to leave behind. "Reyes," he said. Not captain, not colonel, whatever rank the man held now, just his name. "It's Major now," the man said, not like he was correcting him, more like he was offering information that might be useful. "Okay," Ethan said. "Major." They looked at each other for about 2 seconds, the way men do when there's history between them that has no good summary. "Good to see you," Major Reyes said. "Yeah." Ethan moved toward the door. "Let's go see what we're dealing with." The 14th floor had acquired, in the hours since she'd left, the particular atmosphere of a room where competent people are losing and know it. The air was different, warmer, slightly stale, the way a space gets when too many people have been in it too long, when coffee cups have multiplied on desks and nobody's taken a break because breaks feel irresponsible in a crisis. Priya Mehta was still at her station. Victoria hadn't known her name until tonight. She'd looked it up on the drive over. Priya was the technician who'd made the first call, who had escalated when her supervisor told her to wait until morning. She was sitting at her workstation with the focused stillness of someone who had been awake for 18 hours and was running on something beyond caffeine. She looked up when Ethan walked in. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you've been hoping they'd arrive and didn't realize until this moment that you'd been hoping. "You're Walker," she said. "Yeah. I've been trying to locate the breach point for 4 hours. She pulled up her primary monitor. "It's not responding to any standard isolation approach. Every time we get close, it migrates. It's like I don't know how to describe this, like it knows the architecture." "It does," Ethan said quietly. He came to stand beside her, looking at the screen. Victoria watched him look at it. The data streams, the network maps, the cascading alerts. His expression was careful and specific in a way she couldn't read. Because whoever wrote this attack code had access to the original design schematics. Priya turned to look at him. "That's not possible. Those schematics are classified." "Classified doesn't mean inaccessible," he said. "It means it's harder to get." He straightened. "Where's the infrastructure control room?" "Floor 16, Victoria said. "I can take you." "I know where it is," he said. "I built the room." The room on floor 16 was not large. It had probably been a standard IT closet at some point in the building's history, before Meridian had signed the DoD contracts, and before he, had spent 3 weeks converting it into something more purposeful. It had a single door with a keypad lock, a ventilation system that ran louder than the rest of the building's HVAC, and a diagnostic terminal that was, as far as Victoria could tell, connected to nothing visible in the standard IT infrastructure. Ethan stood at the keypad. He entered a code. The light turned green. Victoria didn't say anything. He'd designed the room 7 years ago, and whatever access protocol was built into that keypad, he apparently still knew it. Either no one had ever changed it, which said something alarming about Meridian's security hygiene, or it was hardwired to something that couldn't be changed without physical modification of the terminal itself, which said something about how he'd built it. She thought about what Colonel Summers had said on the phone. He was politely unmovable. She was beginning to understand what that meant. The room was cool and dim, lit by the blue-gray glow of the terminal screen and a single strip of overhead LED. The diagnostic interface was not like the systems on the 14th floor, where those were populated with dashboards and color-coded alerts designed for a team of technicians. This was sparse, text-heavy, command line forward, the kind of interface built by someone who thought in code and didn't need the information pre-digested. Ethan sat down in front of it, cracked his knuckles once, an unconscious gesture not performed for effect, and started typing. Victoria stood near the door. Major Reyes was behind her. Priya had followed them up and was standing against the wall, arms crossed, watching Ethan's hands on the keyboard with the expression of someone watching a language being spoken that they almost understand. For a while, nobody said anything. Just the ventilation system and the sound of the terminal keys and the soft sound of data moving through a building that didn't know it was under siege. Then Ethan stopped typing. He leaned back slightly, just a degree or two. But Victoria had been watching him, and she saw it. "There," he said. Priya pushed off the wall. "Where?" He pointed at the screen, at a string of characters that meant nothing to Victoria, but apparently meant something specific to the two people in the room who could read it. "That's the breach point. It's not in the relay nodes. It was never in the relay nodes." He turned to look at Major Reyes. "The relay nodes are decoys. The actual entry was through the building's legacy environmental control system." Reyes stared at him. "The HVAC?" "The HVAC system shares a subnet with the secondary diagnostic layer. It's a known integration point. It was an intentional design decision because the environmental controls needed to respond to heat events in the server infrastructure. But it created a seam." He was talking fast now, not perform speed, just the speed of someone who has arrived at the answer and is working through its implications. They came through the environmental subnet, dropped a bridge process into the diagnostic layer, and used that to access the relay architecture from below the encryption threshold, below the level where the automated security would flag it as an intrusion. "How long have they been in?" Reyes asked. "At least 6 hours, probably closer to 8. Ethan turned back to the screen. "They've been patient. That's the concerning part. This isn't opportunistic. This is a targeted operation by people who had time to understand these systems and develop a specific strategy." The word specific hung in the air. Victoria thought about what that meant. Targeted, specific. Someone who had studied these systems carefully enough to find a seam that wasn't visible from the outside. "Who has access to the original schematics?" she asked. Ethan looked at her. His expression was careful and contained and said, without saying anything, that this was a question whose answer she probably wasn't going to like. "That's a conversation for people with higher clearances than me. You designed the systems, which means I know what I built. It doesn't tell me who's had access to the documentation since I left." He turned back to the terminal. "Right now, that's not the problem I can solve. The problem I can solve is getting these people out." What happened in the next 90 minutes, Victoria would later describe to the board as a controlled resolution of the network breach, which was accurate the way a summary is accurate. It contained the facts without conveying what any of it actually felt like. What it actually felt like was this: Ethan Walker working at a terminal in a cold room while the building's senior IT staff cycled in and out, some of them offering input, some of them just watching, and Priya Mehta running between the 16th floor and the 14th, with updates that were coming in from the DoD liaison. He didn't perform urgency. That was the thing Victoria kept coming back to, later, when she tried to articulate what she'd witnessed. Every other person in the building was operating at the frequency of emergency. Elevated voices, tense postures, the physiological residue of adrenaline that makes people move faster, but not necessarily better. Ethan moved at a different speed, not slow, not leisurely, but calibrated. The speed of someone who has learned, probably through the particular education of high-stakes operations, that panic is a resource expenditure and not a useful one. At 12:40, he identified the bridge process and began the work of dismantling it layer by layer without triggering the automated shutdown that the attackers had almost certainly built into their intrusion as a failsafe. This required a kind of patience that was almost painful to watch, the careful, methodical disassembly of a trap, while not touching the wire that would spring it. At 1:10, Fitzgerald appeared in the doorway of the room, looked at the screen and said, "What do you need?" Ethan said, Coffee if anyone's making it. And someone needs to manually isolate the environmental subnet at the physical router level. I can tell you exactly which panel. Fitzgerald blinked. The physical router. Floor 12. Mechanical room, east corridor. There's a gray utility panel behind the water main access. Inside, there's a secondary router box. He described it with the precision of someone who had personally installed it. Pull the blue Ethernet cable. Don't touch anything else. Fitzgerald looked at Victoria. She looked at him. Do it. He left. At 1:23, the bridge process was isolated. Ethan ran a verification sweep, running it twice, not once, because that was how he'd always worked, not assuming the first read was correct. At 1:31 a.m., the critical relay nodes came back online. The alert cascade on the 14th floor stopped. Priya was the one who noticed first. She was at her station when the alert stopped generating, and she sat there for a moment, staring at the sudden quiet of her screen. And then she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the involuntary exhale of someone who'd been holding their breath for 4 hours. She turned around in her chair. She stopped. It stopped. 3 other technicians looked at their screens. Someone said, "Network traffic is normalizing." Someone else said, "I'm reading full connectivity on Relay Cluster 7. And then the 14th floor had a different quality than it had had for the last 4 hours. Not celebratory, not released, but stilled. The way a room gets when the emergency is over and everyone is still calibrating whether to believe it. Upstairs, in the 16th floor control room, Ethan was doing his third verification sweep. Victoria was still in the room with him. She'd been there the whole time, which she realized was probably unusual behavior for a CEO in a crisis. The right optics would have been to be visible on the floor, engaged with the team, managing communications. She'd done none of that. She'd stood near the wall of this small room and watched a man she'd fired 12 hours ago quietly take apart a cyber attack on systems he'd built 9 years ago. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something more dramatic, maybe. The movie version. Frantic typing, countdown timers, someone shouting. It had been none of that. It had been methodical and quiet and almost ordinary looking, except that every person who walked in and looked at the screen and back at Ethan had that same response. That involuntary adjustment of posture, that quality of encountering something that recalibrated your reference points. "Sweep's clean," Ethan said. "All 3 layers." He leaned back in the chair. He rolled his shoulders, just once. Then he pulled out his phone and checked the time. 1:34 a.m. He looked at the phone for a second with an expression she couldn't fully read. She thought he might be checking if there were messages from whoever was staying with Lily. There were none, which was good, which meant the child was asleep and everything at that small house in Pilsen was fine. "Walker," Major Reyes said from near the door. He'd been there on and off for the last hour, running communications with Northern Command on his own radio. "Command wants a debrief at 0600. "I'm not military anymore," Ethan said. "Not hostile, just a fact. Colonel Summers is requesting you specifically." "I know." He stood up, reached over and properly shut down the diagnostic terminal. Not just closing windows, a full sequential shutdown the way the system was designed to be shut down, taking 30 seconds longer than a forced close would have. "Tell Colonel Summers I'll call her tomorrow. After 8. Reyes opened his mouth. "My daughter has school," Ethan said. Reyes closed his mouth. Then he nodded, once. On the 14th floor, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The overhead lights felt less harsh somehow, even though nothing had changed. People were sitting differently. Some of the technicians had actually put their chairs back from their desks, which was the first visible evidence of decompression. Someone had brought out a box of granola bars from somewhere and set it on the central table. Ethan came out of the stairwell and stood at the edge of the room. Victoria watched him. He wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't doing anything with his face that suggested he wanted anyone to say something. He was looking at the screens, probably out of habit, probably still running checks in his head, and the room had gone slightly quieter when he appeared, the way rooms do when a person enters who has a particular gravity. Priya looked up from her station. "Full connectivity. Relay clusters 1 through 9 are all reading normal. We're compiling the intrusion logs for the DoD review." "When you do," Ethan said, Flag the timestamps on the initial environmental subnet activity. Whatever the earliest timestamp is in that log, subtract 6 hours. That's when this actually started. She wrote that down. Got it. He nodded, turned. He was heading for the elevator, Victoria realized. He was done. He was going home. She followed him. Tick. The elevator was empty and slow at 1:40 a.m., which gave her 32 floors of time to say something she hadn't figured out yet. He was looking at the floor numbers change. She said, "I want to do this differently." He didn't respond immediately. "What happened tonight? I don't just mean the breach. I mean what I did today. What this company did." She stopped herself from qualifying it, which was her instinct. Qualifying was another word for reducing. "I made a decision based on a spreadsheet, and I didn't look at the actual person the row represented. That's a failure of judgment. My judgment." The elevator reached the lobby floor. The doors opened. He stood there for a second before stepping out. "You didn't know," he said. Not generously, just accurately. "I should have known something. 3 department heads flagged you." People get flagged all the time. Most of them don't have a classified history that changes the calculation. "This isn't about the classified history," she said. "It's about the fact that a person worked in this building for 11 years and I had no idea who he was." He stepped out of the elevator. She followed. The lobby was empty except for the security guard, who glanced at them and went back to his desk. Ethan stopped near the automatic doors. Outside, the mist had cleared and the street was dark and wet, and reflecting the streetlights in long orange smears on the pavement. He turned and looked at her. It was the first time since the kitchen that he'd actually looked at her fully, not the glancing appraisal or the focused elsewhere look of someone operating in a crisis. He looked at her the way she'd seen him look at Priya's screen, taking inventory. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yeah." "Why'd you come yourself, tonight, to my house?" He paused. "You could have sent Fitzgerald, or Marcus Chen, or just let the military people knock on my door." She thought about it. She could give a functional answer. Because time was a factor. Because I needed to see the situation for myself. And both of those things were true. But they weren't the whole truth. "I think," she said carefully, "I needed to see where you lived." He looked at her. "That sounds strange," she said. "A little." "I watched the security footage. You leaving?" She didn't know why she was telling him this. Maybe because it was 1:40 a.m. and she was tired and the kind of careful, strategic self-presentation she usually maintained had worn thin. "You had a photograph of your daughter." "Yeah." "I wanted to know who that was," she said. "The person who mattered enough to carry out of a building." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the floor, then at the doors, then at something in the middle distance. "Her name's Lily," he said. "I know. She makes me eat," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, a worn, quiet affection, the kind that doesn't announce itself. "Won't let me skip meals. She's 8 and she monitors my nutrition like it's her job." Victoria almost smiled. "That's a lot of responsibility for an 8-year-old. "Yeah, well," he looked at the doors again. "She's a lot of person." The automatic doors slid open as a security guard passed through, and the outside air came in briefly, cold and damp and carrying the smell of the city at night. Ethan pulled his jacket a little tighter. "I need to get back," he said. "I know." She hesitated. "I'll have HR contact you tomorrow to discuss reinstatement. Full role, back pay for the gap. That's a starting point. I want to talk about what actually makes sense for your situation." He looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how much energy to put into the next thing he was going to say. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "Let me think." It was not the response she'd expected. She'd expected yes or no, or the negotiation posture of someone who knew they now held leverage. "Let me think" was something else. The response of someone for whom this job, reinstated or not, was not the primary variable. "Okay," she said. "Think." He nodded, pushed through the doors. She stood in the lobby and watched him walk out into the wet street. No cardboard box this time. No photograph pressed to his chest. Just a man in a jacket moving through the orange-lit dark toward the bus stop on the corner. The automatic doors slid closed. Victoria stood there another moment. Behind her, she heard the elevator open. heard Fitzgerald's voice. He was on his phone, of course, already managing the next thing, the communications strategy, the DoD paperwork, the morning press protocol if this got out. The machinery of crisis management chugging back to life now that the crisis itself was resolved. She turned around. There was a lot to do. There always was. But for a moment, she stood in the quiet lobby of the building she ran and looked at the security desk and the row of corporate logos on the wall and the frosted glass panels that bore the Meridian name in the clean, minimalist font. Someone had paid a design agency a great deal of money to develop. She thought about a kitchen with drawings on the refrigerator, a lavender shampoo child who wouldn't let her father skip meals, a man who had built systems that protected national infrastructure and then walked away from all of it to be home in 8 minutes if something happened at a school 3 blocks away. She thought about what it meant to know what mattered. Not in theory, not as a value listed in a company's mission statement, actually knowing it and organizing your life around it, and not apologizing for that organization even when you were standing on your front porch at midnight with a government SUV at the curb. Her phone buzzed. Fitzgerald, on text this time. Lawyers need to be looped in before 6 a.m. for DoD disclosure protocol. Available? She typed back. Yes. Give me 10 minutes. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the security footage monitor above the desk. The lobby camera, the same one she'd watched that evening, hours ago, showing a man in a cardboard box and an empty room and the automatic doors closing on the rain. Then she turned and got back in the elevator. There was work to do. He got home at 2:17 a.m. Mrs. Kowalski was asleep in the armchair by the living room window, a small, wide woman in her 70s who smelled like cinnamon rolls and kept a rosary in her cardigan pocket and had never once in 6 years asked Ethan a question he didn't want to answer. She'd simply shown up when he called, the way she always did, wearing her house slippers and carrying a paperback she'd fall asleep over within 20 minutes. The book was open on her lap now, splayed face down on a chapter she'd probably never finish. Her reading glasses had slid to the end of her nose. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. Something about the image, this elderly woman asleep in his armchair, doing him a kindness at 2 a.m. without asking why, made something in his chest do a thing he didn't have good words for. He left a note on the kitchen counter, "Thank you, Ethan," folded a 20 under the corner of it, and covered Mrs. Kowalski with the blanket from the couch. Then he went upstairs. Lily's door was mostly closed. He pushed it open 2 inches. In the dark, he could see the shape of her under the blanket, the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She'd kicked the covers half off, the way she always did. She ran hot, had since she was a baby, always waking with her hair damp and her cheeks flushed. He came in quietly and pulled the blanket back up. She didn't wake. He stood there for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. There was a version of himself, some 7 years ago version, who would not have recognized this life. The narrow house, the bus schedule, the school 3 blocks away. The small, ordinary acts of daily maintenance, the meals and the bedtimes and the grocery runs and the parent-teacher conferences. That version of himself had operated in classified facilities and secure networks and the compressed, high-stakes world of people who understood what it meant when infrastructure failed. He wasn't that person anymore. Or rather, he was still that person, in the way you don't stop being things you've been, but he'd put it somewhere specific, filed it away in a room with a lock, and taken up residence in a life that was smaller and slower and better. He pulled the door mostly closed and went to bed. He slept until 6. By the time Lily came downstairs at 6:45 in her fox pajamas, and the previous night had been compressed, the way nights always are, in the morning, into something smaller and more manageable. Ethan was already at the stove with eggs in the pan and the coffee maker running. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her hair in approximately 7 different directions and looked at him. "You're back," she said. "I'm back." She came and sat at the kitchen table, pulled her knees up to her chest, and leaned her chin on them, watching him. "Did you fix it?" He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Fix what?" "Whatever was so important that they came to our house at midnight." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the eggs. "Yeah," he said. "I fixed it." She considered this with the judicial gravity she brought to most things. "Good. she said finally. Yeah. He slid the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of her. Eat. You've got 25 minutes before we need to leave. I know how long I have, she said, picking up a fork. Do you want toast? Do we have the sourdough? We have regular bread. She made the face. The specific face she made about regular bread, which communicated, without words, that regular bread was a compromise she would accept under protest. Fine, she said. Yes. He put bread in the toaster and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter drinking it while she ate. And for a few minutes, the kitchen was just the kitchen. The refrigerator with its overlapping drawings, the library book on the counter, the scratched surface of the table where Lily was doing math homework between bites of egg, because she'd remembered she hadn't finished it. Dad, she said, without looking up from the worksheet. Yeah. Mrs. Kowalski left before I came down. She left a note. Lily pointed at the counter. He looked. There was a note he hadn't seen, written in Mrs. Kowalski's looping, old country handwriting on the back of a grocery receipt. Lily was good. You also should eat breakfast. I made banana bread, is in the cabinet. He found the banana bread. He cut 2 slices and put them on a plate. She always does that, Lily said, still doing math. Does what? Makes extra food. For you. She finally looked up. She thinks you don't eat enough. She and you should form a committee, he said. Lily looked at him for a second with an expression that was half amusement and half something more serious. Maybe we will, she said, and went back to her worksheet. He dropped her at school at 7:42, 4 minutes later than usual, which he noted and which would require him to walk a little faster, and stood at the school gate and watched her disappear into the building without looking back, the way she never looked back at drop-off, because looking back was, in her considered 8-year-old opinion, embarrassing. He stood there an extra moment anyway. Then he walked back to the bus stop and called Marcus Chen. Marcus answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call. Ethan, he said. The use of his first name was different from last night. Less formal, a little careful, the voice of a man recalibrating the relationship in real time. Ms. Bennett said HR would be in touch, Ethan said. She told me this morning. I wanted to call you myself. A pause. How are you doing? I'm fine. He meant it. He was tired. The particular bone-settled tired of 4 hours of sleep after a high-stakes night, but he was fine. I want to talk about what reinstatement would actually look like. Of course. Full restoration of your position is the starting offer. I don't want my old position back, Ethan said. A beat of silence. Okay. The maintenance role worked because of the schedule flexibility. That's the non-negotiable part. He was at the bus stop now, checking his phone for the next arrival. 11 minutes. I need to be available for school drop-off and pickup. I need to be reachable when Lily's sick. I need the option to work remotely on certain days. If reinstatement means returning to a role where those things are conditional on someone else's approval, I'm not interested. I understand, Marcus said, and he sounded like he actually did. What kind of role would work? I'll think about it, Ethan said, but I wanted to say that first, so there's no confusion about what I'm negotiating toward. Fair enough. Another pause. Ethan, I should have fought harder for your position. When I brought the flags to Victoria, I should have been more direct about what I thought they meant. Ethan looked at the bus schedule on his phone. 9 minutes. You did your job, he said. You brought it to her. What she did with it was her decision. Still. Marcus, he said, I don't need an apology from you. But if you want to do something useful, make sure the process for the next round of cuts includes a real review of what the flags mean, not just noting them. A pause. I'll do that. Good. The bus appeared at the end of the block right on its revised schedule. I'll come in Thursday. We can talk. He hung up and got on the bus. Victoria Bennett's morning started at 5:50 a.m., which was not unusual and involved 3 consecutive calls with the DoD Liaison Office, Meridian's legal team, and the company's communications director, in that order, none of which she could fully discuss with any of the others because of the classification layers involved in each conversation. By 8:30, she was in her office with a coffee she'd already let go cold, reviewing the incident log that Fitzgerald had compiled overnight, and trying to read something specific in the data that she couldn't yet articulate. The breach had been targeted. Ethan had said it clearly. This isn't opportunistic. Someone had the schematics. Someone had studied the architecture specifically enough to find a seam in systems that had been classified and running for 9 years. That was the thread she couldn't put down. She called Colonel Summers directly. "You've seen the intrusion logs," she said, without preamble, because Summers was the kind of person who preferred no preamble. "We have." The attacker had access to the original design schematics. "We're aware." "Who had those?" A pause that was longer than it needed to be. "That's an active investigation, Ms. Bennett." "I understand. I'm not asking for the investigation conclusions. I'm asking who had authorized access to Walker's original design documents over the past 9 years. Another pause. "A short list," Summers said finally. "Cleared contractors, senior DoD infrastructure personnel, and 3 private defense firms who've worked on adjacent systems." A beat. "And the security review board that evaluated the architecture before final approval." Walker wasn't on that list. No, he had already resigned by the time the formal review was completed. Victoria was quiet for a moment. He built systems he was never given access to review. "That's standard protocol," Summers said. "Once personnel separate from a program, they lose access to program documentation. It protects the security of the architecture. It also means he couldn't see if anyone was mishandling what he built." A pause. "Yes," Summers said, without inflection. "It does mean that." Victoria thought about what it meant to build something, walk away from it for reasons that had nothing to do with the work itself, and then spend years with no visibility into what happened to it, whether it was maintained correctly, whether the rotation cycles were updated on schedule, whether the documentation was kept secure, whether anyone was watching the seams. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. She put the phone down. She pulled up a blank document and started writing, not an email, not a memo, just notes, the way she did when she was trying to think something through. She wrote, "Who is responsible for what gets built?" And then, "Who is responsible after the builder is gone?" And then she sat looking at those 2 questions for a while before she closed the document without saving it. It was Thursday when Ethan came in. He arrived at 9 because 9 gave him time to see Lily to school and get to the building on a bus that didn't require any transfers. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he'd always worn at Meridian: dark jeans, a plain button-down, work boots that had been resoled twice. He had not dressed up for this meeting, and Victoria noticed that, and noticed herself noticing it, and thought about what it said that she'd half expected him to. He didn't go to the front desk. He went straight to the elevator because he'd spent 11 years in this building and didn't need to announce himself. She met him in the conference room on the 12th floor, the smaller one, not the one with the boardroom table and the view of the lake. That room was for performances. This one had a round table that seated 8 and windows that looked at another building, which gave conversations in it a more practical quality. Marcus was there. She'd asked him to be, partly because she wanted the HR formalities handled by someone whose expertise was HR, and partly because she wanted a witness to her own behavior, a habit she'd developed after the first year, bringing someone she trusted into important meetings so that she could be accountable to what she'd actually said, not just to what she'd later remember saying. Ethan sat down. He put his phone on the table face down, which she'd noticed he always did, which meant he wasn't expecting anything important and had chosen to be present. "Coffee?" Marcus offered. "Please," Ethan said. For a few minutes, they dealt with the functional layer, Marcus outlining the reinstatement terms, the back pay calculation, the insurance bridge for the 11 days he'd been technically out of employment. Ethan listened and asked specific questions about the benefit structure and the payroll timing, the questions of a person who understood exactly what he needed and wasn't going to pretend the practical details didn't matter. When that was done, the room went slightly quieter. "Tell me what you want," Victoria said. He looked at her. "I already told Marcus." "He told me the parameters. I want to hear what you actually want." He was quiet for a moment, drank some of his coffee. She had the impression he was deciding how honest to be, not because he was calculating, but because he was a person who'd learned to be careful about putting things into words. "I want a role that uses what I actually know," he said, "not fixing thermostats. Not because there's anything wrong with that work. It's good work, someone has to do it. But because I've been doing it for 11 years, partially because it was convenient, and partially because I didn't want to be visible." He paused. "What happened Tuesday night changed that. People know things now that they didn't know before." "Your background," she said. "Yeah." He set down his coffee. "I spent a long time being comfortable being nobody here. The guy you call when the AC goes out. That was fine. It was what I needed." He looked at the table. "But I can't go back to that now, and honestly, I don't think you'd want me to." "No," she agreed. "I wouldn't." "So," he looked at her directly, "I want to work on the infrastructure security side. I know these systems, Meridian's DoD connected architecture, the relay network, the diagnostic layer. I built the bones of it. I should be the one helping maintain it properly." He paused. "Part-time. Flexible schedule, mostly remote with defined on-site days. Full visibility into the documentation for the systems I designed. And a direct line to whoever handles the security review process, so that if there are gaps like the one I found Tuesday night, they get addressed before someone finds them from the outside." Marcus was writing. Victoria was watching Ethan's face. "That's a senior advisory role," she said. "That's not a maintenance technician's compensation package." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm telling you what the work is worth and what I'm willing to do." "Okay," she said. "Then that's what we build." He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating quality he'd had since the first night, taking inventory, checking for sincerity. She'd grown accustomed to it. She didn't think he did it strategically. She thought it was just how he looked at things. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The breach on Tuesday. Whoever did it had the schematics. That's not a coincidence." He leaned forward slightly. "Someone gave them information that should have been classified. That's either a leak inside a cleared contractor, or it's something worse. The DoD is investigating, but Meridian has an interest in that investigation because if it turns out the breach point originated from a documentation leak connected to our DoD contracts, this company has liability exposure that goes well beyond Tuesday night." Marcus looked up from his notes. "You want to be part of the investigation," Victoria said. "I want to make sure someone in this building is paying close attention to it," Ethan said. "Because Colonel Summers is a capable officer, but she's not thinking about Meridian's specific interests. She's thinking about national security. Those two things aren't always the same." He looked at her steadily. "You need someone in the room who understands the technical architecture well enough to catch if the investigation misses something, and who has enough clearance history to be included in the relevant briefings. That would be you. That would be me." She sat back in her chair. The morning light was coming through the windows at a flat angle, the particular gray-white of a Chicago October morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it wanted to be. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to tell me if it's out of line." He tilted his head slightly. "Okay. Why Meridian, specifically?" She folded her hands on the table. "You could have gone anywhere. After your commission, with your background, any defense contractor in the country would have taken you. Why here? Why a maintenance job in a building in Chicago?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah grew up in Pilsen," he said. The name landed quietly. Marcus stopped writing. "My wife," Ethan said, for Marcus's benefit, because Marcus hadn't been on the calls where this had come up. "She grew up 4 blocks from where we live now. Her parents were there, her sister." He looked at the table. "After she died, I wanted Lily to grow up near her family, near people who remembered Sarah, so she'd have that." He paused. "The job at Meridian was the job that opened up in the right time frame, in the right part of the city. That's it." Victoria was quiet. "Her parents still live there," he said. "The Nguyens, 2 blocks from us. Lily goes over on Sundays." He finally looked up. "That's the actual reason. It's not complicated." "No," Victoria said. "It's not." The room was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the city moved. The distant glint of the L train. A courier bike threading between cabs on the street below. The ordinary, continuous motion of a city that didn't know or care about the conversation happening 14 floors up. Marcus said quietly, "We'll get the paperwork drafted today, Ratsom." Ethan left the building at 11:20. He had 40 minutes before he needed to catch the bus that would get him home in time to be there when Lily got out of school at 3:10. He used 15 of those minutes to walk up Michigan Avenue in the direction of a coffee cart he liked. A battered setup run by an older man named Gerald who'd been parking it in the same spot for years and made an Americano that was better than anything served in any of the 3 coffee shops within 1 block of it. He got his coffee and stood on the sidewalk drinking it and watched the city do what it did. He thought about what he'd just agreed to. The meeting had gone the way he'd expected, which was useful, because he'd spent considerable time on the bus ride over working through what he was and wasn't willing to do. He'd been clear. She'd been clear. Marcus had written things down. There would be paperwork and lawyers and the particular machinery of corporate formalization that turned verbal agreements into documented ones, which was fine. That was how these things worked. What he hadn't expected was the part at the end. The part where he'd told her about Sarah and Pilsen and the Nguyens. He didn't tell people that. Not usually. Not because it was a secret, but because it was his. The specific architecture of how his life had been arranged around the people and places that mattered. And it required a certain amount of trust to hand pieces of it to someone. He wasn't sure when he decided to trust Victoria Bennett with that piece. Somewhere between her standing in his kitchen at midnight and the moment she'd said, "Let me to the military attaché on his porch," taking the knock on the door for herself. It was a small thing, but small things were the ones he paid attention to. He finished his coffee, threw the cup in the bin on the corner. He had a bus to catch. He didn't know, walking to the bus stop, that Gary Hollis had been watching the 14th floor monitors on the overnight shift when the breach resolved. That Gary had stood at the edge of the room at 1:31 a.m. and watched the alert cascade stop and heard Priya say it stopped and understood, in the specific way of someone whose job is adjacent to the thing he's watching, what had happened, and who had done it. He didn't know that Gary had called Danny Reyes at 7 in the morning and told him, and that Danny had said "I told you" in a voice that was more uncomfortable than vindicated. He didn't know that Priya Mehta had stayed until 4 a.m. compiling the intrusion logs and that she'd written in the incident report, under resolution method, a description that would later be read by DoD auditors, and which ended with the phrase, "breach resolved through direct intervention by original architecture designer, who demonstrated comprehensive working knowledge of system design without access to any current documentation." He didn't know that 3 different people on the overnight team had pulled up his employee file on the internal system, the maintenance technician file, the thin one with the 3 department head flags, and that each of them had sat with that file open on their screen for a while without doing anything. He also didn't know that later that afternoon, when Lily came home and found him making grilled cheese in the kitchen, she would put her backpack down and stand at the kitchen counter and say, with the blunt assessment that was her primary mode, "Maya's mom heard you work at a defense company. She said something happened there." He'd turn off the burner and look at her. "What did she say?" he'd ask. "She said there was a cyber emergency, and someone from the building solved it." She'd look at him with those dark eyes, measuring. "She said it was someone who used to be in the military." He'd flip the sandwich, let the silence sit for a second. "Is she wrong?" Lily would say. "Put your backpack away," he'd say. "Plates are on the counter." She'd look at him for one more moment, and whatever math she was doing would resolve itself, and she'd pick up her backpack and take it to the foot of the stairs. Then she'd come back and get 2 plates from the counter and set them on the table without being asked again. They'd eat the grilled cheese. He'd cut hers in triangles because she'd declared last year that diagonal was scientifically superior, and he hadn't found reason to argue. She'd tell him about her spelling test. 9 out of 10 thoroughly had gotten her, the double letters. And he'd ask if she wanted to practice the words she'd missed, and she'd say not right now, and he'd say okay. After dinner, she'd do her reading on the couch while he washed the dishes, and at one point she'd say, from behind her book, "Dad." "Yeah." "You're not in trouble or anything? From what happened?" He'd dry a plate. "No, Bug. I'm not in trouble." "Okay." The sound of a page turning. "Good." He didn't know any of this yet, walking to the bus stop in the pale October morning. He just knew the bus was in 3 minutes, that Lily got out at 3:10, that the Nguyen's had mentioned Sunday dinner, and he'd said he'd think about it. He'd say yes to the Sunday dinner. He usually did, eventually. He got to the bus stop with 40 seconds to spare. The bus arrived, and he got on, and the city scrolled past the windows all the way back to Pilsen, and he looked at it without thinking too hard about anything in particular, which was its own kind of rest. The thing about building systems, the deep, load-bearing kind, the ones that other things relied on without knowing it, was that you couldn't always see them working. That was in a way the point. A system that announced itself was a system that hadn't been built well enough. The good ones just ran, quietly, in the background, doing what they were designed to do while everything else moved on top of them. Ethan Walker sat on the number 18 bus and thought about nothing. And the city moved, and the morning kept going, and somewhere 3 blocks from a school in Pilsen, a small house waited with a refrigerator full of drawings and a library book on the counter and a blanket on the couch that smelled slightly like cinnamon. He'd be home in 22 minutes. That was enough. The DoD investigation took 11 days. Ethan knew it would take at least that long. These things always did. The careful process of subpoenaing documentation and interviewing cleared personnel and running forensic analysis on systems that required their own clearance level just to access. He'd been part of enough post-incident reviews in his previous life to understand the rhythm of them. The first 3 days were chaos organized to look like methodology. The middle days were where the real work happened. The final days were about deciding what to say and to whom about what had actually been found. He spent those 11 days building something new. The advisory role that Victoria and Marcus had formalized in paperwork gave him a workspace. Not an office exactly, more like a converted corner of the 16th floor IT room, the one with the diagnostic terminal he'd used the night of the breach. Someone had put a desk there, a decent chair, a secondary monitor. It was quiet and slightly too cold, the same ventilation system running loud overhead. And it suited him in a way the maintenance corridors had suited him, which was to say it felt like a room built for function and not for show. He started with the documentation. The security architecture he designed 9 years ago had been built to specific tolerances, with specific rotation cycles and maintenance protocols. And the first thing he needed to understand was how much of it had drifted. Systems drifted. That was the thing civilians didn't always grasp. It wasn't that anyone necessarily made a bad decision. It was that thousands of small decisions made over years, each one reasonable in isolation, accumulated into something meaningfully different from what had been originally designed. Entropy, in systems as in everything else, was patient. Priya Mehta became his unofficial second in these 11 days, not through any formal arrangement, but through the organic process of 2 people who were both doing similar work in the same building and found it more efficient to do it together. She'd knock on the open door of the 16th floor room, set a coffee next to his monitor without asking if he wanted one, and sit down at her laptop. Sometimes they talked through what they were looking at. Sometimes they worked in parallel silence for an hour before one of them said something. She was good. That was the thing he kept arriving at. She was 26 and she hadn't been doing this long, but she thought in the right directions. She asked the next question, the one past the obvious one, and she was comfortable saying she didn't know something, which was rarer than it should have been. On the 4th day, she said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He glanced at her. "Depends on the question." "Why maintenance? For 11 years, at this building specifically." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I know the Pilsen part. It got around. But there's a gap I can't close. You could have consulted privately, done remote advisory work, used your background to do something that wasn't physically fixing things in a building." "I was fixing things in a building," he said. "You know what I mean?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the small room, someone on the 14th floor was on the phone, voice distant and muffled through the wall. When Lily was 2, 3, 4, she needed a parent who was there, he said. Present. Not traveling, not on call for classified operations, not in facilities she couldn't visit, or doing work I couldn't explain to a kid. I needed a job that started and ended on a schedule, that stayed in one building. He paused. The maintenance work was actually useful. Good work. I was good at it. "You're also good at this," Priya said, nodding at the screens. Yeah, well, he picked up his coffee. Lily's 9 next month. She doesn't need the same things she needed at 2. He said it practically, the way he said most things, but there was something underneath it. Not quite wistfulness, more like the careful acknowledgement of something that was true and required handling. Priya didn't push further. She turned back to her laptop. They worked until 6, and then Ethan shut down his terminal the way he always did, sequentially, methodically, 30 seconds longer than necessary. The DoD's preliminary findings arrived on day 8 in the form of a classified briefing that Colonel Summers delivered in person. She flew in, which told Ethan something about the weight of what she was bringing. The meeting was in a conference room with no windows and a signal jammer running on the table, which was standard for this classification level and which Victoria Bennett handled with slightly wider eyes than she probably meant to show. She was seated to Summers' right. Ethan was across from them. 2 of Summers' analysts sat against the wall with laptops, not speaking. Fitzgerald was not in the room. The decision to exclude him had been Ethan's suggestion and Victoria's call, made 3 days earlier. It was not a decision Fitzgerald had received warmly. The intrusion origin, Summers said, setting a folder on the table, traces to a cleared contractor called Aldous Group. They worked on a system integration project adjacent to the relay architecture in 2021. As part of that contract, they were given read-only access to a subset of the original design schematics. She paused. That access was supposed to be revoked at the end of the contract term. It wasn't revoked, Ethan said. No. She opened the folder. It wasn't revoked because the contract closeout was handled by a junior compliance officer who missed it in the documentation, and the gap wasn't caught in subsequent audits because the access was classified above the clearance level of the people running the audits. Victoria looked at him. He kept his eyes on Summers. The breach was executed by a state-sponsored group operating through Aldous Group Infrastructure, Summers continued. We don't believe Aldous was a willing participant. Their systems were compromised separately. They were used as a proxy. She let that land for a second. The attackers had the schematics, understood the architecture, and spent approximately 4 months developing the specific intrusion method before executing it. 4 months, Victoria said. They were patient. Walker said that. She glanced at him. The night of the breach. Summers looked at Ethan with the evaluating expression she'd carried since he'd known her. She'd been a major when he'd worked alongside her office a decade ago, the kind of officer who never seemed to be operating at less than 3/4 speed. Your countermeasures held longer than they should have, she said, given the encryption key drift. I built redundancy into the secondary layer, he said, in case the primary rotation cycle wasn't maintained. You anticipated maintenance failure. I anticipated human nature. He said it without judgment. People get busy. Documentation gets filed and not reviewed. I tried to account for that. Summers looked at him for a moment. You built a failsafe for your own failsafe. Yeah. And it bought us the time we needed on Tuesday night. He didn't respond to that. Meridian's liability exposure, Summers said, turning to Victoria, is complicated. The access gap was technically a DoD compliance failure, not a Meridian failure. But the fact that the compromised schematics related to infrastructure housed in your building creates... We've been through this with legal, Victoria said. I understand the exposure. What I want to know is what happens to the relay architecture now. That's partly why I'm here, Summers said. We need to rebuild the security layer properly, with updated rotation cycles, revised access controls, and a formal ongoing review protocol. She looked at Ethan. We'd like Walker to lead the rebuild, as a formal contracted advisor to the DoD, separate from his arrangement with Meridian. The room was quiet for a moment. I'd need to see the terms, Ethan said. Of course, and I want to be clear about my availability. I have a 9-year-old. I don't work nights. I don't travel for more than 3 consecutive days without advance arrangement, and if there's a school event I've committed to, that takes priority. Summers looked at him steadily. He'd expected resistance, or at least the professional pause of someone deciding how to frame a counterargument. Instead, she said, We'll put it in writing. Then I'll look at the terms. Cool. After Summers and her analysts left, Victoria stayed in the conference room. Ethan stayed too because he'd seen from her expression as the others filed out that she had something to say and was working out how to say it. She sat down across from him. The board is going to want to know, she said, what prevented this from being caught before Tuesday night. They're going to look for a person to hold accountable. And the honest answer is that it was a failure distributed across multiple systems and multiple years, not a single decision made by a single person. She paused. But that's not a satisfying answer for a board. No, he agreed. It isn't. She was quiet for a moment. Fitzgerald missed it, she said. The access gap? He was responsible for the annual security documentation review in 2022 and 2023. The Aldous Group access should have been caught in one of those reviews. He didn't have the clearance to see the access level that was left open, Ethan said. That's the gap Colonel Summers described. He had the clearance to flag that a clearance gap existed and escalate it, Victoria said. He didn't. She looked at the folder Summers had left. He also didn't tell me that the relay architecture security reviews were being handled by personnel below the relevant clearance level. I didn't know that until this week. Ethan watched her face. She was doing the thing he'd observed in her since the meeting on Thursday, working something through in real time, not presenting a conclusion but actually thinking, which was different from what he'd expected of her at the start of this, and different from most people he'd worked with in either of his careers. What are you going to do about it? He asked. I don't know yet, she said. The honest answer. That's a better answer than most. She looked at him. I need to change how this company handles security review, not just the DoD-connected stuff, the whole framework. Who has visibility into what? How clearance gaps get flagged, how the people doing reviews have access to escalate things they can't see themselves. She paused. I need someone who understands how these systems fail to help me build a process that catches it before it becomes Tuesday night. That's a significant project, he said. Yes. For an advisory role that's mostly remote with defined on-site days. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile. I'm aware of the irony. Tell me what you have in mind, he said. In terms of scope. She pulled out a legal pad. She worked on paper for certain things, he'd noticed that, and they spent the next 40 minutes talking through it. Not the formal version, not the version that would eventually go to the board with a title and a budget allocation. The rough version, the one with corrections and things crossed out and written again with arrows indicating that this piece should actually come before that piece. He wrote on it too, when she slid it across the table. Drew a structural diagram in the margin, the way he always thought best, visually, spatially, the relationships between things rather than the things themselves. When they were done, the legal pad looked like something a person might actually use. You're going to need buy-in from legal and from the DoD liaison simultaneously, he said. They won't agree on scope, but they'll agree that they both need to be involved, and that shared resentment is actually useful. It means neither of them will block the process to score points off the other. She looked at the diagram in the margin. How do you know that? Because it's how institutions work. He slid the legal pad back. They fight over content. They agree on inclusion. If both sides feel consulted, you can usually move forward on the parts they disagree about while they're busy arguing. She wrote something at the top of the page. He couldn't see what it said. The news broke on day 9, which was earlier than Summers had predicted and later than Ethan had expected. It came out first in a defense industry trade publication, a short, careful piece that described a cyber intrusion attempt on DoD-adjacent commercial infrastructure that had been successfully contained. It named no individuals. It named no companies. By noon of day 9, 2 mainstream outlets had picked up the story with the names filled in. Meridian Defense Technologies, the specific relay architecture, the nature of the attack. Victoria was in front of it within 3 hours, which was fast enough to be ahead rather than reactive. The communications team had a statement. She gave a brief press availability in the lobby that Ethan watched on the lobby monitor from the elevator bank, and by 5 p.m. the story had the shape of a managed disclosure rather than a scandal, which was the best outcome available. What the mainstream outlets didn't have, and what Ethan noticed they were missing, was his name. Either Summers' office was actively suppressing it, or the reporters hadn't found the thread yet. He was inclined to think it was a combination of both. He He was wrong about the second part. On day 10, his sister Dana called at 7 p.m. while he was making dinner. "Turn on channel 7, she said, without saying hello. He didn't have the TV on. Lily was doing homework at the table. But he opened the Channel 7 app on his tablet and turned it so Lily couldn't see. The anchor was reading from notes. The banner at the bottom of the screen said, "Exclusive. Former military cyber commander behind Meridian breach response." They had his name. A photo. An old one from his military years, the kind that circulated in alumni databases and defense community directories. Some sourcing he couldn't immediately identify. The anchor was saying, "Sources confirm that the individual who resolved the attack on DoD connected infrastructure was Ethan Walker, a former decorated cyber defense commander who had been working until this week as a maintenance technician at the same facility." He turned the tablet face down on the counter. "Dad?" Lily said, not looking up from her homework. "Yeah." "Is dinner almost ready?" 10 minutes. She went back to her worksheet. He stood at the stove and thought about what this meant for the next few days, in the specific practical way he thought about problems. There would be calls. There were already calls. His phone had gone silent in that particular way it did when too many notifications were stacking. Dana was still on the line. He'd forgotten her. He picked up the phone. "Dana." "They're saying you were a maintenance technician," she said. She was not using her normal voice. She was using the other voice, the one that came out when she was trying to manage how she was feeling by focusing on logistics. "For 11 years at the same company." "Yeah." "Ethan." A long pause. "You could have told me." "Told you what? That I used to be in the military?" He stirred the sauce. "You knew that." Not this. Not the level of this." He could hear her breathing. "The news is saying national infrastructure. They're saying you designed, but..." "Dana," he said, "we can talk about it. Not right now. Can I call you back after Lily's in bed?" A silence. "Yeah," she said, quieter. "Yeah, call me back." He put the phone face down again. Lily had stopped writing and was looking at him over her worksheet with an expression he recognized, the one that appeared when she was deciding whether to ask something directly or circle around it. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, and went back to the worksheet. He knew that was not true, but he also knew she'd come to it in her own time, which she always did. She came to it at bedtime. He was sitting on the edge of her bed, the lamp on low, and she was under the blanket in the fox pajamas that were now definitively too short and that she still refused to retire, and she looked at him with that dark-eyed, measuring look. "Maya's mom called our house today," she said. He was quiet. "She called to ask if you were really the person on the news." Lily looked at him evenly. "I didn't know what to say, so I said I'd ask you." "What did you tell her?" "I said I didn't know anything about it." She paused. Which was true. He thought about how to handle this. He'd been thinking about it, in the back of his mind, since she'd been 3 or 4. The moment when the locked room would need to be opened, at least partially, when the simplifications he'd maintained for the sake of a small child would need to be replaced with something more complete. He hadn't expected it to be now. He'd been thinking maybe 12, 13. Old enough to have some framework for it. She was 9. "I used to have a different job," he said, "before you were old enough to remember." She looked at him. "In the military?" "Yeah." "Doing what?" He thought about how to say it at the right altitude. Not too much, not too little, and nothing that would turn into questions he couldn't answer in a way that would let her sleep. "I was part of a team that protected important computer systems. When people tried to break into them, we stopped them." She considered this with the thoroughness she brought to things she was taking seriously. "Is that what you did the other night?" "Something like that." "The systems were the ones you built before?" He looked at her. "Who told you that?" "Nobody. I figured it out." She was matter-of-fact about this. "You said you fixed it. The news said someone who built the systems fixed them. You used to work in the military doing computer things." She paused. "It wasn't that complicated." He almost laughed. "No," he said. "I suppose it wasn't." "Why didn't you tell me?" The question sat in the room simply, without accusation. She was 9 and she was asking a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. You were 2 when I left that job, he said. By the time you were old enough to ask, it felt like a different life. Something that didn't have much to do with our life here. He paused. And I didn't want you to think about me differently. She frowned. Differently how? He wasn't sure how to explain this to a 9-year-old. He wasn't sure he could fully explain it to himself. There was something about having been very good at a thing that required you to be, in some sense, a harder version of yourself. Operating in a world of classified facilities and national stakes and decisions made under pressure, and then choosing deliberately to become the person who makes grilled cheese and takes the bus and is home by 3:10. The 2 versions of himself had never fully made peace with each other. He just learned to keep them in separate rooms. I liked being just your dad, he said finally. Here, in this house, taking you to school. He looked at the blanket. I didn't want the other thing to be the main thing. Lily was quiet for a long moment. It's not the main thing, she said. He looked up. You being my dad is the main thing, she said, with the directness that 8 going on 9-year-olds sometimes produced, the unmediated clarity of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften everything. The computer stuff is just a thing you can also do. He sat with that for a second. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. She settled back against her pillow. Can we not talk about it at school? Maya's mom is already... I'll figure it out, he said. Don't worry about it. I'm not worried, she yawned. I just don't want it to be a whole thing. I know. He turned off the lamp. She was asleep in 6 minutes. He sat on the couch downstairs for a while with his phone in his hand and let the notifications accumulate without opening them. Dana, twice more. 3 numbers he didn't recognize. A text from Marcus that said simply, Media Protocol. Call me when you can. A text from Priya. You're famous, kind of annoying for the rest of us. He almost smiled at that one. The one he hadn't expected was from Major Reyes. It came in at 9:47. Saw the news. Heads up. There's going to be a commendation process initiated. You'll want to get ahead of it if you don't want the attention. Call me. He set the phone on the cushion. He knew what commendations looked like. He'd been through the process before, years ago. The formal acknowledgement of something that had happened in a room with no windows, translated into language safe for public consumption, and presented with the particular fanfare of institutions celebrating themselves for producing someone exceptional. He'd found it uncomfortable then. He was going to find it more uncomfortable now. He picked the phone back up and called Reyes. Reyes answered on the second ring. I figured you'd call tonight. What's the process? Northern Command is initiating a formal commendation for the breach response. They're also, and this comes from higher up than me, considering reopening a discussion about your reserve status. Ethan was quiet. You were never formally discharged, Reyes said. You resigned your commission, which put you in a particular category. There are people who believe the events of Tuesday night constitute grounds for... No, Ethan said. A pause. Walker, no, he said again, evenly. Not angry, just clear. I'm not going back on active status. I'm not re-entering any kind of formal military structure. What I did Tuesday night, I did as a civilian, and that's how I want it classified. He paused. The commendation, I can't stop that, I understand that, but I want it kept as quiet as possible. No ceremony, no press availability, no public record, if that can be arranged. The public record part is complicated, given that the news already has... Then complicated is what it is, Ethan said. I'm telling you what I want. What happens is a separate question. Reyes was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly. Something in it that wasn't quite formal, more like a man who had known someone for a long time and was choosing, for a moment, to speak as that. You know what you did, right? Tuesday night. You understand the scale of it. Yeah, Ethan said. I know. A lot of people in a lot of important rooms are talking about your name this week. I know that too. And you want it quiet. I want it quiet. Another pause. Okay, Reyes said. I'll do what I can. Thank you. He hung up. He sat on the couch a while longer, The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside us, a car went down the block and its headlights moved across the ceiling. He thought about what Lily had said. You being my dad is the main thing. The computer stuff is just a thing you can also do. He'd spent 9 years building a life organized around that arithmetic. The main thing in the center and everything else arranged around it. The bus schedule and the school drop-off and the Sunday dinners at the Nguyens and the library book on the counter and the fox pajamas that were too short. The world outside, the rooms with no windows, the classified systems, the operations that had no good summary. That world had found him again, the way it apparently found people who were good at the necessary things. He'd handled it. He'd do what the advisory role required. He'd help rebuild what needed rebuilding. But he'd done the arithmetic a long time ago, and the answer hadn't changed. He got up, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. He was asleep before 10. The commendation ceremony happened on a Wednesday morning in November, in a conference room at Northern Command's Chicago liaison office, and it lasted 22 minutes. There was no press, no public record beyond the classified citation that would sit in a file somewhere with a clearance level above building administration. Ethan had asked for that through Reyes, and Summers had made it happen, which told him something about how much weight the people in important rooms were giving his name that week. Enough weight to honor a preference for quiet. 6 people were in the room. Summers, Reyes, 2 officers he didn't recognize who stood against the wall with the practiced stillness of people trained to be present without being visible. A civilian DoD representative named Hargrove who had the compressed, joyless manner of someone who processed commendations the way an accountant processes quarterly returns. And Ethan. Victoria had offered to come. He'd said it wasn't necessary. She'd accepted this without argument, which he'd appreciated. Summers read the citation in her compressed, efficient sentences. It described the breach, the threat to critical national infrastructure, the resolution. It used the language of official documents, which meant it was accurate in every particular and somehow conveyed nothing of what it had actually been like to sit in a cold room at 1 a.m. working layer by layer through a trap someone had spent 4 months building. When she finished, Hargrove handed Ethan a folder. Inside was the citation, signed, a formal letter of commendation. And on a separate sheet, a document he hadn't expected, a notice of reinstatement to reserve officer status, unsigned, with a line at the bottom waiting for his name. He looked at it for a moment. That's voluntary, Summers said. No pressure attached to it. He closed the folder. I know. He set it on the table. I'll think about it. He didn't think about it. He already knew. But there was a courtesy in saying, I'll think about it to people who had gone to the trouble of preparing a document, and he'd learned in years of working with institutions that courtesy was a small but real form of respect. After the ceremony, if 22 minutes in a windowless conference room could be called a ceremony, Reyes walked him to the elevator. They stood waiting for it in the particular companionable silence of 2 men who had known each other in a different context and were figuring out what that meant now. You look good, Reyes said finally. I mean that. You look like someone who's sleeping. Most nights. That's more than most of us can say. The elevator arrived. Reyes held the door. The offer's real, Walker. Reserve status. It's not a trap. Nobody's trying to pull you back in. I know, Ethan said. He stepped into the elevator. I appreciate it. Reyes let the door close. On the way down, Ethan stood with the folder under his arm and looked at the numbers changing and thought about what it meant to be recognized for something you'd done when you weren't trying to be recognized for anything. There was something slightly wrong-footed about it. The experience of a thing that had felt, in the doing of it, entirely uncomplicated, being formally acknowledged in a way that suggested it was exceptional. He'd just done what he knew how to do, in the only way he knew how to do it. The elevator reached the lobby. He walked out into the November cold and caught the number 18 bus home. The unsigned reinstatement document sat in the folder in the drawer of the desk he'd set up in the 16th floor workspace. He hadn't thrown it away. He also hadn't signed it. He wasn't sure yet what that meant, except that he'd spent 9 years being very certain about the decisions he made, and he wasn't certain about this one, and uncertainty, in his experience, was usually a signal to wait rather than act. The work in the meantime was real and substantial. The The security architecture rebuild took the better part of 6 weeks. Not 6 weeks of continuous on-site hours. It was distributed, mostly remote, the kind of work that happened in chunks across early mornings before Lily woke up, and afternoons while she was at school, and occasional late evenings when he could put in 3 focused hours before his brain stopped producing useful output. Priya ran point on the implementation side. He designed the structure, wrote the protocols, specified the rotation cycles and the access control framework, and the clearance level escalation process that would theoretically prevent a compliance officer from unknowingly leaving a door open for 4 years. She turned those specifications into actual working systems, with the particular competence of someone who'd been underestimated for long enough that she'd stopped waiting for permission to do things well. They worked well together. Not easily. She pushed back when she thought he was being overly conservative, and he pushed back when he thought she was moving too fast. And they developed a shorthand for these disagreements that was efficient without being friendly in a way that felt performed. It was collegial, functional, the kind of working relationship that forms between people who respect each other's judgment and don't need to pretend they're friends. One afternoon in the 3rd week, she looked up from her laptop and said, "The original architecture, the seam through the environmental subnet, did you know that could be exploited when you built it?" He thought about it. "I knew it was a theoretical vulnerability," he said. "I didn't have a good solution for it that didn't create other problems." The environmental integration was a functional requirement. The servers genuinely needed to be able to respond to heat events. Removing the integration would have created operational issues. He paused. "I documented it as a known risk and flagged it for review." "In 2018, she said. He looked at her. "I found the flag in the archived documentation," she said. "From the initial security review. You flagged it as a known risk requiring periodic monitoring." She paused. "Nobody ever followed up on it." He sat with that for a moment. It was a particular feeling, not vindication, nothing as clean as that, more like the strange vertigo of watching something you'd worried about and put aside come back around years later in the form you'd half expected. "Someone should have followed up on it," he said. "A lot of someones," Priya said, "over a lot of years." "Yeah." He turned back to his screen. "So we build the part that makes sure someone follows up." She turned back to her laptop. That was the closest either of them came to talking about what had almost happened and what hadn't. Fitzgerald left the company in the 4th week. It wasn't announced dramatically. It was handled the way these things are handled when everyone involved understands that a departure is inevitable and a managed one is preferable to a contested one. Victoria informed the senior staff in a brief email. Fitzgerald's name disappeared from the org chart. Someone sent a farewell card around the 14th floor that received a smattering of signatures, not unfriendly but not effusive. The lukewarm collective goodbye of people who weren't exactly sad about a thing, but weren't going to say so out loud. Ethan didn't sign the card, not because he held anything against Fitzgerald, he didn't particularly, but because he'd never had a relationship with him that would make signing it feel like anything other than a gesture. Victoria asked him about it, obliquely, in one of their bi-weekly check-ins. These had become a regular thing. 30 minutes, usually late afternoon, sometimes in the small conference room, and sometimes, when neither of them wanted to deal with the formality of a conference room booking, just standing at the window end of the 16th floor with 2 coffees and the gray November sky behind the glass. "How's the team responding?" she asked. "To Fitzgerald leaving?" "To all of it, the changes, the new protocols." He thought about it honestly. "Mixed," he said. "The people who understand the technical implications get it. The people who see it as additional reporting requirements are resentful." He drank his coffee. "That's normal. Any process change that creates accountability where there wasn't accountability before is going to feel like punishment to the people who benefited from the gap. Is there a way to reframe it that helps?" "Not really. You can explain the rationale until you're out of breath and people will nod and still feel what they feel about having to do new things." He paused. "The reframe happens over time. When the process catches something before it becomes a crisis. When people see it work. That's when the resentment converts into buy-in." She looked out the window. "I keep thinking about the 3 department head flags," she said. It wasn't the first time she'd mentioned them, but it was the first time she'd said it in this particular way. Not as an admission or an apology, but as something she was still turning over. I looked at them and made a spreadsheet decision and went home. You were doing your job, he said. Badly. She said it without drama or self-flagellation, just accurately. Nobody told you what the flags were actually about, he said. The department heads wrote things like high-value resource. That's a bureaucratic compliment. It doesn't tell you anything specific. It should have made me ask a specific question. Maybe. He set down his coffee. But you're doing the thing people do after something goes wrong, which is imagining that every mistake was preventable if someone had just been paying closer attention. Some of them are preventable. Some of them are just the shape of how things fail. Not because of one bad decision, but because of 10 adequate ones that accumulated into something nobody intended. She looked at him. That's a very generous analysis. It's an accurate one, he said. Generous would be pretending the adequate decisions were good enough. A silence. Outside, the L train went by on its elevated track, the familiar rhythmic clatter of it, and for a moment the city was present in the room in the way it sometimes was through windows. I want to do a full review of the personnel evaluation process, she said. Not just security clearances, the whole thing. How we identify what people actually know versus what their job title says they know. That's a big project. I know. She looked at her coffee. I keep thinking about the guy who spent 11 years in this building knowing more than everyone in it, and nobody thought to ask what that knowledge actually was. He didn't say anything to that. Not to put it on you, she said quickly. I know. He picked up his coffee. I also didn't offer. I was comfortable being nobody. Why? He'd been thinking about this, in the way he thought about things he didn't have good answers to, circling back to it in the background, checking whether a different angle produced something useful. Because being visible means being needed, he said. And being needed in a work context is a different kind of need than being needed at home. One of them you can walk away from when the situation resolves. The other one you can't. He paused. After Sarah, I was very careful about what I let need me. Victoria was quiet. That's the part that's hard to explain to people, he said. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't pretending. I was just managing my exposure, keeping the main thing the main thing. Lily said that to Dana, Victoria said. He looked at her, surprised. Your sister mentioned it in passing. She called me last week, actually. He set down his coffee. Dana called you? She did. Something moved across Victoria's face that he hadn't seen before, but slightly amused, slightly touched. She wanted to tell me, in specific terms, what kind of person you are, and what she expected the company to do right by you. A pause. She's very direct. She really is, he said. She also said, and I'm quoting directly, Lily told me the computer stuff is just a thing he can also do. You should think about what that means. Victoria looked at him. I have been thinking about it. He was quiet. It means you organized your life around a set of values and you actually followed through on them, she said. Not as a concept. Not as something you say in a mission statement and then optimize around when it's convenient. Actually followed through every day for 9 years. It wasn't noble, he said. It was what I wanted. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He didn't answer that. Gone. Sunday dinner at the Nguyen's happened in late November, the week before Thanksgiving. It was a standing practice, had been since Lily was 3, and Mrs. Nguyen had established, with the quiet authority of someone who was not asking permission, that Sunday dinner was a family event, and Ethan and Lily were family, and that was the end of the discussion. The Nguyen house was 4 blocks from his, narrow, warm, pachi-chir, perpetually smelling of whatever had been cooking since that morning. Mr. Nguyen, Thomas, though Ethan had spent 3 years calling him Mr. Nguyen before being firmly corrected, was a retired electrician who had opinions about baseball and woodworking and very few other topics, and who expressed affection primarily through feeding people and asking no questions. Mrs. Nguyen, Anne, was not like that at all. She was sharp and specific and had, from the beginning, made clear to Ethan that she was going to remain in his life, and by extension, in Lily's life, regardless of whatever discomfort that might occasionally cause, because her daughter had loved him, and that was reason enough. It had taken him 2 years to stop finding this difficult. Lily was already at the table when Ethan arrived, having been dropped off an hour earlier while he finished something for work. She was sitting next to Anne, showing her something on a piece of paper that turned out to be a drawing she'd done in art class. A house, two figures in front of it, the proportions working slightly better than the crayon portrait on the refrigerator. Progress. Thomas shook Ethan's hand at the door, which was how he said hello, and went back to the kitchen. Dinner was bun bo hui, which An made every time she wanted to have a conversation that required fortification, which Ethan had learned years ago was most Sunday dinners. He sat at the table and ate and answered questions about work in the particular careful way required by the overlap between what had been public and what was still classified, and listened with the concentrated attention she brought to everything and didn't pretend to follow the technical parts, which he appreciated. "You were on the news," Thomas said, not looking up from his bowl. "Briefly," Ethan said. "The reporter said you were important." Thomas said this with the mild skepticism of a man who had lived long enough to distrust the characterizations of television reporters. "Were you important?" "I fixed something," Ethan said. Thomas looked up. "Same thing?" "Not exactly." Thomas considered this. "Did you fix it completely?" "Yeah." Thomas nodded and went back to his bowl. "Good." That was the whole conversation. An waited until Thomas had carried his bowl to the kitchen. He always cleared his own bowl, had since Ethan had known him, 42 years of marriage, and this remained one of his fixed practices. Before she looked at Ethan directly. "How are you?" she said. "Not how's the work, not how's the situation. How are you, the person?" "Better," he said. And then, because Anne could tell the difference between better as deflection and better as truth, actually better. The job is real. The work is good. He looked at Lily, who was telling a story to the empty doorway in the dramatic, full-body fashion she employed for stories she considered important. "She's good." "She told me about the pajamas," Anne said. He looked at her. "She said she's decided to retire them." Anne smiled just slightly. She said they're too small, but she didn't want to throw them away, so she folded them up and put them in the box on her closet shelf. The one with the things she keeps. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That box," he said. He knew the box. A shoebox that had started as a tooth fairy repository and evolved into a general archive of things Lily designated as worth preserving. A friendship bracelet, a ticket stub from the first movie he'd taken her to, a smooth stone she'd found on the lake shore when she was 6, a photograph. He'd never looked inside it without permission. He'd seen her open it occasionally, considering its contents with the seriousness of a curator reviewing a collection. "She said the pajamas belong in there now," An said, "because they're from an important time." He didn't say anything. Anne looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, not with pity, which he'd always been grateful for, but with a particular kind of attention that acknowledged things without requiring them to be spoken. She'd known him for 9 years. She'd watched him make every mistake a person could make while figuring out how to raise a child alone. And she'd offered help in the specific ways he could accept it and stayed out of the specific ways he couldn't, and he owed her more than he had good words for. "Sarah would have liked this," Anne said quietly. "How you've done it." He nodded once, not trusting what else might come out if he said something. "She worried," Anne continued, "when you were both—" She stopped. Reconsidered. "She worried that you gave things up for the family. She worried about what you'd do without the work." "She didn't say that to me," Ethan said. "No," Anne said. "She said it to me." A pause. "I think she wanted to, but she didn't know how without it sounding like she was pushing you away." She looked at her hands. "She would have wanted you to know that she knew what you gave up, that she saw it." Ethan sat with that for a long moment. The kitchen sounds filtered through. Thomas washing his bowl, the particular rhythm of it. Lily's story in the doorway had apparently reached a resolution because she'd stopped and was looking satisfied with herself. "I didn't give anything up," Ethan said finally. "That's the thing she didn't have to worry about." He said it carefully because he meant it carefully. "I made a choice, a clear one. People always want to frame that as sacrifice, like something had to be given up for something else to be gained. But I wanted the thing I chose. every version of me that existed when I made that choice wanted it. He paused. The only person who needed to see that was her. I'm sorry she didn't get to. And looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly. Just a moment, the way you acknowledge something that doesn't need acknowledgement but deserves it. She knew, Anne said. I think she knew. Lily came back from the doorway and climbed into her chair and looked at both of them with the shrewd assessment of a child who has registered that a serious conversation was happening and is deciding whether to ask about it. She decided not to. Can I have more? She asked, pointing at the pot. Anne got up to serve her. December came in gray and cold, the way Chicago Decembers always did, and Ethan's life reorganized itself around its new shape, the way lives do. Not smoothly, not all at once, but gradually, the way water finds a level. He was on site at Meridian 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, because Tuesdays had a brutal irony he'd decided to lean into rather than avoid, and Thursdays had become the day Priya ran the full system review and preferred to have him available for questions. The other 3 days he worked from the 16th floor desk remotely, which meant from the kitchen table, mostly, or occasionally from the library 3 blocks from the school when he needed a change of environment and Lily had after-school activities that bought him an extra 2 hours. The work was what it was, real, technically demanding, occasionally tedious in the specific way of infrastructure work, which involved a great deal of verification and very little glamour. He'd always been fine with that. The glamour had never been the point. Victoria called one afternoon in the second week of December. Not a scheduled check-in. She had his number now and used it when she had a specific thing to say. The board reviewed the security process changes, she said. They approved everything. Good. They also asked who designed the new framework. What did you tell them? I told them the truth. A pause. They want to acknowledge it formally. A board-level recognition. Not public. Internal. A meeting where they say thank you in person. Victoria, he said. I know, she said. I told them you might not want that. I don't. What if I told you it matters for the people in that room? Not for you, for them. Her voice had the quality of someone who had thought this through before saying it. They made a decision, or rather, they approved a budget cut that someone else recommended and didn't ask questions about. And things turned out fine, but they could have turned out very differently. Having to sit in a room and say thank you to the person they indirectly fired is uncomfortable. I think they should be uncomfortable. He was quiet for a moment. That's unusually direct, he said. I'm having a more direct month generally, she said. He could hear something like dry amusement in her voice. Will you come? He thought about it. When? 3rd week of December, afternoon, so you can do school pickup. Yeah, he said. Okay. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. I'm doing it because you made a good argument. I know, she said. That's the kind of thanks-worthy thing. The board meeting was 15 minutes, which was the right length. 7 people in a large conference room with the lake visible through the windows in the winter-gray distance. They stood when he came in, which he found faintly absurd and didn't say so. The board chair, a man in his 60s named Arthur Prescott, who had made his money in defense electronics and had the wary, deliberate manner of someone accustomed to rooms where things went wrong, shook his hand and said, We owe you more than we can adequately express in a meeting, but we wanted to try. I appreciate that, Ethan said. They said the things they needed to say. He listened because listening was the thing he could offer, and because there was a real quality to some of it, not the formal language, which was exactly as polished as you'd expect from people who'd spent decades in formal settings, but underneath it, in the moments when the script ran out and someone said something unrehearsed. One of the board members, a woman who'd been quiet through most of it, said, I kept thinking about your daughter after I found out. I have kids. I kept thinking about being 8 years old and your father leaving at midnight to fix something that was everyone else's problem to prevent. Ethan looked at her. It wasn't everyone else's problem, he said. It was mine. I built the systems. You left those systems. Yeah, he said. I did. And I'd make the same choice again. He said it without heat, without defensiveness. Lily needed a parent more than those systems needed a designer. That's not a close call. He paused. But the systems still mattered. They still mattered to real people, so when it needed doing, I did it. He looked around the room briefly. That's the whole story. Arthur Prescott nodded slowly. We've restructured the security review board, he said. New clearance thresholds, annual documentation audits with appropriate clearance access. He paused. It should have been that way from the beginning. Yes, Ethan said. It should. He didn't soften that. There was a point at which softening became dishonest. Arthur Prescott looked at him with the expression of a man absorbing a fair and direct thing. Noted, he said. The meeting ended. Victoria walked him to the elevator. That went well, she said. Define well. Nobody cried. Nobody got defensive. Two of them looked genuinely uncomfortable, which means something went in. She pressed the elevator button. Prescott will remember that conversation for a while. Good, Ethan said. That's the point. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. She held the door for a second. Ethan. He looked at her. Thank you. Not for the breach response, for the rest of it. The work since. The way you've done it. You're paying me, he said. I know, she said. That's not what I'm thanking you for. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once. She let the door close. On the last Friday before the winter break, Lily's school had a performance. Not a play, nothing that elaborate, more like an organized showcase of what each class had been working on through the fall. Third grade had done a unit on maps and geography, and they'd built a large collaborative piece, a hand-painted map of the city with neighborhood names in wobbly, earnest lettering and tiny illustrations of the things each neighborhood was known for. Pilsen had a mural on it. Lily had painted the mural. Ethan stood at the back of the gymnasium with the other parents and watched her point it out to Anne and Thomas, who had come, and to Dana, who had driven down from Milwaukee the night before and was staying on the couch and had been making pointed but affectionate observations about the state of his refrigerator since she arrived. Dana came to stand beside him while the kids were demonstrating their maps. She's good, Dana said. I know. The mural especially. She paused. She told me she painted it because Pilsen is where Mom grew up. He watched Lily explaining something to Thomas with an authority that suggested she had strong opinions about the artistic choices involved in the illustration. Yeah, he said. Dana was quiet for a moment. His sister had a quality when she decided to be still, of genuine stillness. She was normally the most active person in any room she occupied, but occasionally she stopped, and in those moments she was completely present in a way that was different from her usual mode. I'm sorry I didn't know, she said. What you used to do, all of it. Donna, let me say it. She looked at him. I knew you were military. I knew the job was serious. I didn't know the level of it, and I should have tried harder to understand, and I think the reason I didn't was that it was easier to just let you be my brother who moved to Chicago and was figuring it out. She paused, which was selfish. It wasn't selfish, he said. It was what I wanted. I know. She looked at Lily again. I just want you to know that I see it now. What you built here, it's really something, Ethan. He didn't answer for a moment. It's just a life, he said. Yeah, she said. Exactly. Across the gymnasium, Lily had finished explaining the mural and had turned to scan the room, the specific scan of a child locating their person. She found Ethan, across the distance of the room, and her face did the thing that faces do when you're 8 years old and you find the person you were looking for. Not quite a smile, something more unguarded than that. A brief, uncalculated openness before she went back to being the composed person who did not wave from across rooms. She turned back to the map. Ethan turned back to watching her. This is the part of the story that's hardest to tell because it's the part that resists the kind of language we reach for when we want to say something meant something. The big moments, the breach, the boardroom, the commendation, the apologies. Those have shapes. They fit into sentences. But this one, a man standing at the back of a gymnasium watching his daughter point at a map she'd painted, doesn't fit as neatly. It's too small, too ordinary. And somehow that's the whole point. There's a version of this story that wants to end with the recognition. The board meeting, the handshake, Prescott nodding at something he hadn't been told plainly enough before. That version wants to say the world finally saw who he was, and that mattered. But the world's recognition had never been the variable. The thing about people who are genuinely good at something and who've thought clearly about what they're doing and why, they don't need the world to catch up. They've already done their math. They know what they chose and why they chose it, and they live inside that choice in a way that makes external validation feel beside the point. Not unpleasant, just not the point. Ethan Walker had spent 9 years being invisible in a building full of people and had used that invisibility to be exactly where he needed to be, every day, for the person who needed him most. Nobody had asked him to do that. Nobody had built a process that would catch it or a spreadsheet that would flag it. It was just a man making a decision in a hospital room and living the consequences of it forward with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided what matters and refuses to be argued out of it. The lesson, if there is one, and he would be the first to tell you he wasn't in the business of drawing lessons from his own life, is something like this. The most important things people do are usually invisible, not because they're hiding, because the nature of load-bearing work is that it looks like nothing from the outside. The relay nodes don't announce themselves. The architecture doesn't wave from across the room. It just runs, quietly, underneath everything that depends on it, doing exactly what it was designed to do. People are like that too, the ones who hold things up. You don't always know what you're standing on until it shifts. Victoria Bennett knew this now. She'd learned it the way most people learn the important things, not from a book, not from a lecture, but from a specific moment when the gap between what she'd assumed and what was actually true became impossible to ignore. She'd stood in a kitchen with drawings on the refrigerator and understood something about value that no finance background or MBA program had ever found a way to teach. That the thing worth most is often the thing nobody has put a price on yet. She'd changed things. Not perfectly, nothing ever changed perfectly. But she'd changed the process, the structure, the way the company looked at the rows in the spreadsheet. She'd sat with the discomfort of her own mistake instead of burying it in action. And that sitting had produced something more durable than a quick fix. It was slow and imperfect and ongoing, the kind of change that doesn't have a press release. Priya kept working. She ran the security reviews with the competence and particular stubbornness she'd had on the night she made the call her supervisor told her not to bother making. She'd been told before, in various contexts, that she was being too careful, too thorough, too unwilling to move on before she was satisfied something was right. She was going to keep being too careful. She'd decided. Major Reyes, in his office at Northern Command, filed the unsigned reinstatement document in a folder and kept the folder in his desk drawer. Not because he expected it to be signed, but because he'd learned, over years of working with people who were exceptional at things, that the ones worth keeping around were the ones you had to keep making room for. You kept the door open. You let them decide when and if they walked through it. The Nguyens had Sunday dinner and cooked. Thomas cleared his own bowl. Lily helped set the table and narrated with considerable creative liberty the events of her week. On a Tuesday in January, a cold one, the kind where Chicago earns its reputation, Ethan got to Meridian at 9, took the elevator to the 16th floor, entered the keypad code, and sat down in front of the diagnostic terminal. He ran the morning system check the way he always did, sequentially, methodically, starting from the environmental subnet and working up through the relay architecture layer by layer. Everything was clean, the rotation cycles were on schedule, the access logs showed normal activity patterns. The seam he'd flagged in 2018 and that no one had followed up on had been properly sealed in the rebuild, tested 3 times, and cleared. He wrote his notes in the review log. Flagged one minor anomaly in the secondary diagnostic layer. Not a concern, probably a logging glitch worth watching, and scheduled a follow-up check for Thursday. He closed the terminal. He had 40 minutes before his 9:30 call with the DoD liaison office, and he spent them at the window at the end of the floor, with coffee, looking at the city. The L went by on its tracks. Cabs on the street below. The particular gray-white of a January sky that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. At 3:10, he'd be at the school gate. Lily had a vocabulary test on Thursday. They'd been practicing the words at dinner. Inevitable, cumulative, resilient. She'd gotten resilient wrong twice and right once and was annoyed about this in the way she got annoyed about things she cared about. They'd practice again tonight. After dinner, at the kitchen table, while the refrigerator hummed and the city moved outside the window, he'd get it right. She'd get it right. It would be fine. The L went by again, its rhythm as familiar as the bus schedule, as familiar as the sound of a door pushed mostly closed. He drank his coffee. He waited for 9:30. He was, all things considered, exactly where he meant to be.